Vietnam, 25 years after the war, the Southeast Asian country remembers its painful past and hopes for a brighter future. In the U.S., a somber day. Americans pay tribute to those who served in the conflict and paid with their lives. And the deadly scourge of AIDS, why the White House now views the disease as a national and global security threat. And Miami divided, how the fight over Elian Gonzalez has polarized this city of many cultures. Hello from the CNN Center in Atlanta. I'm Brian Nelson. Andrea Hall is off today. Thank you for joining us. Exactly 25 years ago, the Vietnam War ended, and people are pausing to celebrate or to just remember. Large crowds gathered today at Washington's Vietnam War Memorial. The wall holds the names of more than 58,000 American soldiers who died in the Vietnam conflict. In Vietnam itself, the anniversary of the war's end is cause for celebrations. CNN's Richard Blystone was there and has the details now from Ho Chi Minh City.
In the relative cool of 6:30 in the morning, the old soldiers remembered the past. Vo Win Giap on the left, the general whose strategies had frustrated Japan, France, and then the United States. When the balloons went up, the focus lifted to Vietnam today and tomorrow. A display of national pride, an assertion of national unity. Soldiers too young to remember the war paraded past some 20,000 invited guests within the grounds of what was the palace of U.S.-backed President Nguyen Van Thieu and is now called Reunification Palace in what's now called Ho Chi Minh City. General Nguyen Thu Cuong was one of the first to arrive here 25 years ago and says he could never have imagined then the way it would look now. Vietnam's Vice President Nguyen Thi Binh, once a high-ranking Viet Cong, says we must use our experiences to establish friendly and cooperative relations on every side. Out the gates and into the streets for a half-kilometer walk past a couple of thousand of the uninvited, including a handful of American visitors. But there are many in this former southern capital who have little reason to celebrate the advent of communism. A short parade to mark so great a transformation. It was not so much victory, but independence and hope that seemed to lift hearts this day. The finality of what happened here 25 years ago started a new kind of military era for what is now the world's only superpower, the United States. Grenada, Somalia, the Gulf, Kosovo, but never another Vietnam. Richard Blystone, CNN, Ho Chi Minh City.
Bombs and landmines left over from the Vietnam War remain a very dangerous threat to Vietnamese civilians. These long-forgotten weapons are blamed for many serious injuries every year. CNN's Rusty Dornan now tells us how one American is hoping to help the victims.
He's a big wheel when it comes to collecting classic cars. Ken Behring owns one of the most luxurious automotive museums in the world. Now his dream is to set some simpler wheels in motion. Wheelchairs for the needy, people worldwide who have trouble getting from here to there.
Mobility is the same as sight or sound. If you don't have mobility, you have no world.
Vietnam was one of the first places Behring took his wheelchair crusade. Bombs quit falling here 25 years ago. It's been that long since many here walked. Not all of the bombs exploded. More than 100,000 Vietnamese have been killed or injured by landmines and unexploded ordnance since the war.
In a way, I think that, we're a little responsible indirectly for some of the minefields and for some of the misery they've suffered. And I think we should do what we can to at least make life a little more pleasant for them.
Some estimate 300,000 Vietnamese children born since 1975 suffer mental and physical defects. Defects blamed on dioxin, the byproduct of Agent Orange, a defoliant used during the war. In places like Vietnam, those who are crippled, young or old, are often left alone in the poorest conditions.
There's a whole class of people that have been discarded. People are ashamed of them. They feel that it's a curse or it's bad genes. and they don't want to carry them in their back because that's the only way they can move them. So they really just put them in the corner of a room, made so they really last.
Bering has donated 1,000 wheelchairs in Romania, South Africa, Vietnam, and Guatemala this year. So far, he's footed the bill, but will open his Wheelchairs for the World Foundation in June, a foundation with dreams of motion for millions.
This first year, my goal is to try to give away or find 100,000 wheelchairs, and I'd like to get up to 1 million a year.
Mobilizing people whose roads have been less traveled. Rusty Dornan, CNN, Danville, California.
On Capitol Hill today, thousands of Americans marched in support of gay rights. The demonstrators in the Millennium March on Washington for Equality gathered this morning at the Washington Monument and then walked to a site near the Capitol. Organizers say they want commitments for more hate crime legislation and equal rights in marriage and parenting during the upcoming national elections. The U.S. State Department's annual report on terrorism comes out tomorrow. An advance copy lists the usual suspects and cites 2 new threats as well. Nations still considered sponsors of terrorism include Cuba, Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea, Sudan, and Syria. All have appeared on that list since 1993. Well, now for the first time, the State Department says its focus on terrorism has shifted from the Middle East to the South Asian nations of Afghanistan and Pakistan, the 2 newest additions. Well, for the first time ever, the Clinton administration is declaring AIDS a new threat to national security and global stability. The National Security Council advisors will lead a review of U.S. policy to fight AIDS and will look at the disease's worldwide effects. Joining us now to discuss this new initiative is Sandy Thurman. She is the co-chair of the President's National AIDS Policy. Ms. Thurman, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
First question is, why now? And why is AIDS a threat to U.S. security?
Well, certainly now that we have 34 million people infected worldwide, we have in Africa alone 5,500 men, women, and children dying of AIDS each and every day. We're beginning to understand that this epidemic not only has health implications, but has implications as a fundamental development issue, an economic issue, and a stability and security issue.
Why stability and security? I mean, this kind of declaration was usually associated with a national defense emergency.
Well, it is, but when we look at the impact that AIDS is having on developing nations around the world, when we see countries that have 20% of their population of adults infected with HIV who are going to die of HIV, when we see all the indicators that we've used in the recent past to mark the progress of nations declining, like infant mortality and child mortality and life expectancy, which are all being dramatically reduced as a result of this epidemic, we understand that we have to respond in ways that are different than we have in the past.
So let's ask how this declaration will help rein in the disease in India, for example, or Africa.
Sure. Well, let's take Africa, for instance. The good news is that we have developed effective programs on the ground in Africa that allow us to stem the spread of HIV. What happens when we have the National Security Council involved in this epidemic is that it gives us the ability to bring those programs to scale with the logistical expertise that the national security community brings, with the diplomatic expertise that is necessary to sort of pave the road for leaders around the world to respond to this epidemic. This gives us a whole new ability to respond to AIDS like we would respond to any other international threat.
So does this mean that this country will begin sending out teams of experts to foreign countries?
Well, it does. I mean, we've already been doing that for the last 15 years of the epidemic. We've had United States teams working with teams on the ground around the world. What this helps us do is encourage leaders around the world to make this a priority by showing leadership. The U.S. has been the leader in the fight against AIDS internationally in the last 2 decades, but this allows us to really put the pressure on others to respond in kind.
Trent Lott, the Senate Majority Leader, suggests this is just election year politics. He says there's no national security threat. So I ask you this question in light of what he said. Why hasn't this been done for cancer or for heart disease, for example?
Well, we've never really seen an epidemic like HIV and AIDS. Clearly, the Surgeon General has said over and over again that AIDS poses the greatest threat to mankind since the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages. And with no vaccine and no cure in sight, certainly in the next couple of decades, we will have literally hundreds of millions of people dying of AIDS around the world. The National Intelligence Council has clearly indicated to us that while Africa is the epicenter of the epidemic today, India will be the epicenter of the epidemic in 15 years, and we see a dramatic increase of AIDS in the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union. So we have an epidemic that's sweeping the globe. We have no way to stop it in terms of science. We certainly don't have vaccines or cures that are available to people in the developing world, or here for that matter. So we have to respond to this because we've never seen a crisis like HIV and AIDS globally.
All right.